the way that we move around in the world just shapes the way we imagine kind of the whole. You could put it that way. Paul Lewis in Miracles likes to call it the whole show. Your particular access point to the world, your life,
Yes.
what it's like to move around in the world, that is going to shape how you see what's going on in the whole show. That's kind of the basic premise there, if we put it that way. Classically, and this is part of where the title is Bulwarks of Unbelief, and I'm drawing on a sociologist, Canadian philosopher. Maybe some of your listeners will have heard of Charles Taylor. Some of them might not have. Charles Taylor is this very important theorist of secularism. Wrote a book called A Secular Age in 2007. And in the beginning of that book, a huge chapter is called Bulwarks of Belief. And what he's trying to do is set up the world in which belief was just natural. In the Middle Ages, say 1500 AD, it was almost impossible for whatever reason. Let's interpret what that is, but it seems like it was almost impossible to doubt the existence of God. And then you go to 2000 AD, right? And even if you're a fervent believer like Shane or I, you can have the experience, nevertheless, of kind of laying awake at night sometimes and be like, well, maybe did I get a dial wrong? Have I done something wrong in the mental algorithm? And that lingering kind of what if is sort of there as at least a kind of mental pest, as it were. And Taylor's saying, kind of your question, something happened in between those two things. And the bulwarks of belief, if I could talk about those, and then bulwarks of unbelief, I think the basic idea there is that the world of the medieval world, and most of the world up until the middle of the 19th century, the average human existence was a subsistence existence. It was a subsistence existence where you lived in small communities around people that you couldn't really avoid, and in spaces and against forces of nature that you had to navigate around and really couldn't harness or control, except in some very basic ways. And so the experience of what it was like to move around, one way of putting that is the experience of what it was like to move around in the world was very agentic. The agency, the voice itself, I've been living in metropolises all my life, and you're right, I'm sitting here in South Carolina now. It's weird to walk outside and like the forest isn't cut down. Its agency, its voice is very living. It is being itself, and I have to move around it. And society worked that way as well. That in a town of 200 or 500 or 1,000 people, everybody. They're stubborn. They don't change their ways, and they feel like things you can't just avoid. And in fact, you're dependent on things you can't avoid. And then you add to that. Subsistence labor itself is also one where your own agency, your own activity is something you feel very keenly, because even if you hate your quote, quote job, as it were, like, I don't want to be a farmer, you know why you're farming, because if you don't, you're going to die in a very immediate way. It's not by degrees of implication. It's just like ground, plant, food, or die. It's that immediate. And so in the mirror of all of that kind of personal, agentic, interpersonal feeling of an interaction, you might say, the idea of a kind of big capital A agent that just grounds out bottom zero, all of that, is just a very natural thing. The cosmos is just like that. And so God is the kind of bottoming out of personhood, agency, is that. If you kind of skip over what we talk about then in the modern period, is think of the reversal of all three of those things in some way. You don't actually have to, increasingly with the proliferation of our mode of life, have to confront people. You can avoid that very personal dimension of people. If we looked at modern labor systems, we would discover forms of labor where people write books and have whole therapy sessions about the fact that they don't feel connected to what they're doing, and they feel carried along even in their very own activity. And then with the vast proliferation of technology, the agency of the creation itself is kind of suffocated, you might say, in some dimension, or at least it's numbed out, you could say. And in the centrifugal force of all that lack of agency, what does the universe bottom out in? Perhaps like as a kind of mental or existential instinct, maybe it bottoms out in agencylessness all the way down. And that can then create the crisis where what the world might seem like on this kind of visceral register can be in tension with what my mind otherwise knows to be the case. Because my mind can still trace out the arguments for the existence of God and say, those make sense. But why do I feel this weird kind of whole person tension?